Again, Bart, I thank you for your great questions, which I will perhaps try to answer maybe later, because I had questions about your presentation as well. You said, for example, maybe Mark was copied only a couple of times. That kind of a scenario for the copying of these manuscripts is absolutely vital for you to come up with the idea that the manuscripts could have been changed multiple times before we get to any of our copies at all. And yet we see that Paul asks that his letters get circulated to various churches, and so people were making copies of his letters. We see that Matthew and Luke both used Mark. And consequently, it must have been copied a couple of times, at least, just for them to use it. It's rather doubtful to suppose that these books, most of them, probably even some of them, were not copied multiple times from the original manuscript itself. In your book, Misquoting Jesus, you said that 1 Thessalonians may have been read so many times that it simply wore out and deteriorated. You didn't say that it could have been read and copied so many times that it wore out and deteriorated. So I give my evidence again. It is not proof. And I'm not the one who says that I know something. You're the one who says that you know that you can't know. I'm the one who's saying, I think we have probability on our side. And we have good reason to come to grips with this. And you can compare this with the Greco-Roman literature and recognize that the New Testament itself is in much, much better shape than those other documents in terms of giving us what the text of the church believed in. And then you have the early church apostolic fathers and other groups that write about this stuff, and the patristic writers that are commenting on the text, early versions, some of which go back to the 2nd or 3rd century, and then they take on a life of their own that's no longer intersecting with the Greek text. Those become, in a sense, an early manuscript that we can look at. One of the problems you've got in your presentation, I think, is you want to say we don't know what the errors were that were created. It went all over the map. Well, if it went all over the map, we would have such incredible chaos. How in the world could those manuscripts have been utterly destroyed so that all we have left are those that seem to fit into orthodoxy as far as what you even confessed, that no essential belief of the Christian faith is affected by any of our extant manuscripts? You also said the earliest scribes made a number of mistakes in their copies and that they were, in fact, the worst scribes we have. I'd like to ask you how you know that. Our earliest scribes, we have as many as 12 manuscripts from the 2nd century. And by the way, you asked about how many we have in terms of a multiplicity of that, and you've asked before, what's my basis for that information? The Kurzgefasste Liste says that there are 10 manuscripts from the 2nd century or on the cusp of the 2nd and 3rd century. And Eldon Epp, in one of his recent articles, actually added one more. He went to 11. I've looked at what T.C. Skeet has said about some of these things. Comfort and Barrett, I think they go way too liberal in terms of giving an early date for the manuscripts, but I've added one more. My number is less than what many people would have. It's one more than what Eldon Epp has. And it's 13 more than what he has through the 4th century. 124 manuscripts I've got, he's got 111. Now, you talk about these early scribes not being literary scribes, not being trained scribes, and then you talk about the ones who are trained, which are in the Middle Ages. That is certainly true. But so is the scribe of Sinaiticus in the 4th century. So is the scribe of Vaticanus in the 4th century. In fact, so is the scribe of P66 in the 2nd century. And that scribe did his work, according to E.C. Caldwell, in a scriptorium where his primary concern was to make pretty letters. He made a lot of mistakes. There's another manuscript that's almost as old as that, P75, that we know was not produced in a scriptorium, not by a professional scribe. It looks like chicken scratches almost. It's legible, but it's certainly not pretty. But that scribe copied out his manuscript one letter at a time. And you and Dr. Metzger both said that P75 and B together attest to a very early tradition, a very ancient tradition. So what I am saying about what I probably know, not certainly know, is what you and Dr. Metzger said in 2005 in the 4th edition of the text of the New Testament. The other thing, though, on these early scribes is that P75 was written in what's called a documentary hand. A scribe who writes in a documentary hand means that he's not trained to be a literary scribe copying literature, but he is trained to be a bureaucrat, a CPA, a bean counter. Those scribes were meticulous, and one of the great pieces of evidence to demonstrate that our manuscripts come back from these documentary hands is the use of numbers in the manuscripts. We don't see this in the more literary manuscripts. What we see is the numbers spelled out, while as in the documentary hands, they are not spelled out. P75 was written with a documentary hand. He was an untrained scribe, and yet Bart agrees that that's one of the very best manuscripts we have of the New Testament. The last question is, when you speak about these manuscripts and the mistakes that they made, what kinds of mistakes are you talking about? In those early centuries, you said that the mistakes that they made were mistakes that were accidental, not intentional. Those are the easiest mistakes you mentioned to discern. Let me give one example as I wrap up, and that is, in one manuscript at John 1:30, it says, has John the Baptist say, "After me comes heir." Well, that doesn't make much sense. The Greek word that he miswrote was aner, which means man. After me comes a man. Now that's a nonsense reading, but I think the next scribe would know, hey, this must mean aner, after me comes a man, speaking about Jesus. Now, if you don't believe that Jesus ever existed, you would not call that a nonsense error. After me comes error, Jesus didn't exist as far as you're concerned. But I think it is a nonsense error and easily corrected by the next scribe. Thank you.
Thank you.